Welcome to the 2024 Volume 6, Issue 1, Part 1 Summer Podcast Edition of the Journal of Philosophy of Emotion, published February 21, 2025. All contents are protected under the Creative Commons, Attribution, Non-Commercial, No Derivatives, 4.0 International Deed. For citations, notes, and references, please refer to the printed articles at www.jpeonline.org. Dedicated to the memory of Joseph Shieber 1970 to 2024. Table of Contents. Book Symposium. Guest Editor. Michael Deckard, Lenoir-Rhyne University. Article 1. Deckard, Michael. 2024. Editorial Introduction to the Mind-Body Politic Book Symposium. Journal of Philosophy of Emotion 6, Number 1. Pages 3 to 8. https://doi.org/10-33497/2024 summer.02. Article 2. Maiese, Michelle and Robert Hanna. 2024. Précis. The Mind-Body Politic. Journal of Philosophy of Emotion 6, Number 1. Pages 1 to 6. https://doi.org/10 33497/2024 Summered 1. Article 3. Cash Mason. 2024. An Activist Distributed Cognition, and the Role of Distributed Social Practices in Social Change. Journal of Philosophy of Emotion 6, Number 1. Pages 7 to 19. https://doi.org/10 33497/2024 Summer.2. Article 4. Jurgens, Alan. 2024. Master Narratives. Ideology Embedded and Embodied. Journal of Philosophy of Emotion 6, Number 1. Pages 20 to 28. https://doi.org/10 33497/2024 Summer.3.
Article 1. Editorial Introduction to the Mind-Body Politic Book Symposium. By Michael Deckard. There have been two world-dividing splits in Western culture since the 16th century, for which reparations are yet to be made. The first split is that between the mind or soul and the body or material nature, which originated with René Descartes, 1596 to 1650. The second split is between philosophical anthropology, or what might now be called philosophy of mind, and politics, MacDonald, 2003-2006. A definition of philosophy as science of the soul has been utterly erased from our memory and our consciousness. There are no longer souls or spirits within the political sphere, unless one is speaking of antiquated fields of learning. Inasmuch as philosophers, psychologists, and political thinkers nowadays believe that the three worlds of mind, body, and politics are one, there are still very few writers and researchers truly contributing to the reparations of these two splits from which we still suffer. For at least 500 years, our culture has yet to heal these rifts. To even say Western culture is problematic. What do we refer to as Western, and what do we refer to as culture? This issue on the mind-body politic is an attempt at reparations within the split in Western culture. Our commentators have each looked at this split through the lens of Michelle Maiese and Robert Hanna's book, entitled The Mind-Body Politic. Each author is attuning the mind and the body to politics, to recover the double breach that needs to be repaired, thus attempting to repair Western culture in the process. The way in which Hanna and Maiese in their earlier work explore the rift of mind and body in their co-written Embodied Minds in Action, 2009, signals the first reparation in order to build a culture of the embodied work of action. Their epigraph to that book began with Descartes' claim regarding not being present in my body as a sailor is present in a ship, and thus what it is like to be a creature with a conscious, intentional mind like ours. Hanna and Maiese, 2009, page 1, emphases in the original. Hanna and Maiese were explicit there when they discussed mainstream contemporary philosophy of mind and cognitive neuroscience as having been significantly distorted and misled by the modern classical idea, deriving from Descartes that disembodied counterparts of our own minds, aka spirits, and mindless counterparts of our own living bodies, aka zombies, are logically possible. Hanna and Maiese, 2009, page 2. tracing the mind-body problem at least to the 17th century, but possibly even to Aristotle as Hanna and Maiese do in their earlier work, and as other scholars such as Deborah Brown, 2006, on Deckard and David Charles, 2021, on Aristotle have done, can contribute to an undivided self, Hanna and Maiese, 2009, page 5 to 6. Both their case studies of higher education and mental health reveal destructive, deforming institutions due to the ideology of neoliberalism and 8 criteria of collective sociopathy: commodification, mechanization, coercion, divided mind, reversal of effect, loss of autonomy, incentivization of desires, and false consciousness. Maiese and Hanna, 2019, page 135 to 156. Topics such as online education are furthering the split of our minds and bodies. Maiese and Hanna, 2019, page 156 to 162, Maiese, 2021. Without being explicitly mentioned in the text of Maiese and Hanna, I cannot help but see the notion of colonization, especially since 1492, as constructing and enabling this neoliberal ideology in contemporary nation-states. Skelkshorn, 2024. Furthermore, how we think of mental health disorders are equally subject to the same ideological split. Maiese, 2022. The second great split between politics and the mind-body relationship might even hold greater weight than the first. How does power or sovereignty relate to the mind-body relationship? Most importantly, as discussed in Mason Cash's commentary on the mind-body politic below, how does the use of top-down power over others contribute to destructive, deforming institutions? Cash, 2024, page 10. Oppression and coercion have gone hand in hand in Western culture's relationship to the other, especially concerning the arrogance of certain forms of colonial thought. How Maiese and Hanna develop a new subfield called political philosophy of mind that integrates a philosophy of mind and emancipatory political theory is what the special issue is all about. Maiese and Hanna, 2024, page 1 to 2. Maiese and Hanna look in particular at 2 institutions: higher education in neoliberal nation-states, 2019, page 117 to 170, 2024, page 2 to 4, and mental health treatment in neoliberal nation-states, 2019, page 171 to 223, 2024, page 2. Their contribution to this discussion is to label institutions in 2 categories: I, constructive, enabling institutions versus 2, destructive, deforming social institutions. Whether in the classroom setting in which sense-making can be a coordinated effort which may contribute to a process of joint cognition, or in social institutions that alienate us, mentally enslave us, or even undermine our mental health, the mind-shaping of institutions is continuous. Maiese and Hanna, 2024, page 2. The process by which neoliberal institutions influence practices and identities, training people to view themselves as essentially self-interested, atomic, isolated agents, motivated at all times by instrumental rationality, and to regard everything as a competition. Maiese and Hanna, 2024, page 2, call this latter view destructive, deforming social institutions. For Mason Cash, however, his main criticism of Maiese and Hanna is that all institutions cannot be wholly creative or wholly destructive. Cash's example of anti-vaxxers points to the peer pressure of neighborhoods and other social groups in which many communities and institutions are comprised of a multitude of different intersecting and overlapping practices, which might well be constructive and enabling in some ways and also destructive and deforming in others. 2024, page 12. Sometimes individuals in such anti-vaccine communities have to secretly become vaccinated in order not to be alienated from their social group. Cash claims that social change needs to be understood in terms of distributed and collective agency. 2024, page 12. Using Sally Haslinger's concept of structures of domination, Cash believes professors and administrators can challenge the dominant ideology through ways we conduct classes, design classes, courses, and curricula, in how we interact with students, in how we encourage one another to research and teach, in how we conduct ourselves in allegedly shared governance committees. 2024, page 13. The term communities of resistance can refer to those within neoliberal social institutions who challenge the dominant ideologies. Alan Jurgens responds to Maiese and Hanna in terms of master narratives and local or personal narratives. While Jurgens agrees with how the neoliberal university and healthcare institutions deform and harm not only the well-being of individuals, but their cognitive capacities as well, 2024, page 21, he believes that a narrative analysis must be added to the seemingly a priori structural analysis. By means of developing habits, effective framing patterns, and the backfire effect, Jurgens explores the transformation of social institutions' ways and means, i.e., narratives of mind shaping. His example of the master narrative of the American dream, where the success is attributed primarily to the individual themselves, reinforcing the beliefs and values of a neoliberal ideology where one is primarily responsible for their own success and must pull themselves up by their bootstraps. Jurgens 2024, page 22. Is a matter of local and personal narratives being fed by a master narrative, aligning himself with narrative thinkers such as Peter Goldie, Daniel Hutto, and Scott Russin, among others. Jurgens' challenge to Maiese and Hanna is to also take into account narrative identities. Josephine Pascoe and Miguel Segundo also examine narrative practices in which Maiese and Hanna's enactive proposal claims that our essentially embodied minds are partially determined and literally shaped by the social institutions we belong to, participate in, or fall under the jurisdiction of. Pascoe and Segundo 2024, page 30. Quoting Maiese and Hanna 2019, page 37. Emphases in the original. From a very young age, this determining and shaping come from narrative archetypes. That is, coherent stories about what actions are permitted and expected from particular types of persons. Pascoe and Segundo 2024, page 30. Referring to Maiese and Hanna 2019, page 199. Beyond narrative archetypes, however, Pascoe and Segundo claim that narrative practices also have active, deliberative, and productive functions, as well as a strong entanglement with our embodiment. Pascoe and Segundo 2024, page 30. They emphasize the diachronic element of narrative in which we understand people, whether ourselves or others, and their actions, in terms of a diachronic, temporally ordered and mostly coherent web of beliefs, reasons, aims, and so on. The term narrative evokes the idea that we interpret ourselves and others as characters in a story, where every action can be made sense of only in terms of the coherent whole. Pascoe and Segundo 2024, page 31. Taking the lead from such researchers as Nick Brancazio or Doug McConnell and Ank Snook's narrative therapy, who consider addictions as enacting a narrative, Pascoe and Segundo claim that we ourselves are prolific narrators, having agency and not just forced upon by archetypes. For Ali Teimouri, Maiese and Hanna criticize the Cartesian mind-body duality, while nevertheless maintaining a dualism about the way society works, opposing the current dystopian world with their own vision of a utopian society. 2024, page 45. Teimouri further criticizes their conceptual structure of neoliberalism, in which the classical Hobbesian doctrine of individuals as egoists seeking their own self-interested goals is connected to big capitalism and scientifically minded technocracy. 2024, page 46. Teimouri asks Maiese and Hanna what they mean by neoliberalism and whether it is a policy framework, an ideology, or a form of governmentality. Can these different understandings of neoliberalism be integrated? While Teimouri points to some specific social changes that are not part of Maiese and Hanna's account, such as addressing unemployment, his real concern appears to be with the therapeutic and self-help culture of our neoliberal era. Can the dystopian/utopian Manichaean framework for understanding social institutions be overcome? Lee Wilson in her commentary examines how the mind-body politics, three modes of embodied cognition, i.e. organic self-regulation, sensory-motor coupling with the world, and intersubjective interaction, can be co-opted in totalitarian regimes. 2024, page 53, discussing Maiese and Hanna 2019, page 17. In a brilliant use of Hannah Arendt's The Origins of Totalitarianism, which is not often discussed in the enactivism literature, she applies Maiese and Hanna's norm of conservation as support ing totalitarian institutions in the operation of terror, The laws of totalitarian terror function to relate individuals by de-individuating them into mere specimen, merging human plurality into a single putative humanity. Wilson 2024, page 53, emphases in the original. Furthermore, the other main element of Wilson's reading of Maiese and Hanna, besides conservation, is adaptivity. Her application of this term applies to Arendt's understanding of ideology, the logic of an idea, which involves the totalitarian state's identification of the development of an idea with the movement of history and nature. Wilson 2024, page 54, using Arendt 1979, page 469. Building upon the two splits I mentioned at the beginning of this editorial, she believes that emancipatory political theory need not necessarily be based on Maiese and Hanna's understanding of essentially embodied minds. Both neoliberal institutions and totalitarian institutions can create disequilibria between the organic, sensorimotor, and intersubjective spheres. Lee or Zmigrodz's contribution to this special issue concerns how human bodies become politicized from the top down, rather than how the body politic emerges from the bottom up. 2024, page 59. Zmigrodz's more sociological perspective, following the analyses of Michel Foucault, Maurice Merleau-Ponty, and Frantz Fanon, as well as contemporary authors such as Sally Haslanger, Victoria McGeer, and Alia Al-Sajji, builds a neurocognitive model of ideological thinking, in which perception and cognition are penetrated by neoliberal ideological ways of thinking. The mechanistic natural sciences of biology and neuroscience do not appear to question themselves as to their ideological antecedents. Zmigrod, following empirical studies, identifies how adherents and non-adherents of ideologies such as nationalism, social conservatism, or religious ideologies can be subject to both cognitive and affective habits of neoliberalism. Her critique takes up William James's 1896 terminology of a genuine option, in which one, there are multiple plausible options for belief and action. 2, choosing belief or non-belief cannot be avoided. And 3, the option is momentous such that the stakes are significant and the choice is not easily reversible. Zmigrod 2024, page 64, using James 1896, page 2. The result for Zmigrod is that adopting or rejecting neoliberal ideology is not a genuine option. Maiese and Hanna reply to these commentaries with 11 worries, collating many of the criticisms. By not only pointing backwards to their collective work in Embodied Minds in Action, Hanna and Maiese 2009, they also point forwards to their future work, a project they call The Shape of Lives to Come. They respond to each of the commentators in turn and continue the collective work of thinking through a political philosophy of mind. Their belief that it is possible to push back against neoliberalism is the repair work necessary for bridging the two splits mentioned above. In their words, effective, robust resistance against neoliberalism is not essentially different from effective, robust resistance against sexist or racist thought-shaping ideology or against any form of moral oppression. Maiese and Hanna 2024, page 80. While speaking to its inherently difficult nature, they believe it is a long-term process and need not be abandoned. Last but not least, in special remembrance, I'd like to highlight Joseph Shieber's 1970 to 2024 contribution. He passed away as this issue of the Journal of the Philosophy of Emotion was going to press. Many of his students and colleagues spoke to his brilliance and kindness. Weinberg 2024. His work on the epistemology of testimony, Shieber 2015, and his commentary here on Herbert Marcuse's One-Dimensional Man in Conversation with Maiese and Hanna, Shieber 2024, speak to the depth of how the rifts between mind and body and political solidarity can possibly be repaired. Shieber, following Marcuse, describes how individuals are indoctrinated and manipulated down to their very instincts, and thus there is a need for understanding how liberatory social institutions are necessary. To use one example from Shieber's own commentary, there are times when the only adequate housing that I can obtain is constructed out of environmentally harmful materials and under unfair labor conditions, and that the social institutions we adhere to only further enable a need such as housing to become deformed due to the societal conditions in which I live. 2024, page 41. Shieber's defense of the solidarity thesis, Maiese and Hanna 2019, page 73, speaks to how it is possible both for an institution to manifest robust solidarity and for that institution to consist of individuals suffering from what Maiese and Hanna term cognitive walls, i.e., effective screens against manifest reality and truth. 2024, page 42, emphases in the original. His defense of cognitive, emotional, and experiential goals that get beyond our cognitive walls and support robust solidarity address the reparations necessary to heal the rift between divisive and soul-destroying aspects embodied and embedded in our Western culture still alive today. We dedicate this issue to his memory. He will be missed. Article 2, Précis, The Mind-Body Politic, by Michelle Maiese and Robert Hanna. Section 1, 2 Basic Aims. Our co-authored book, The Mind-Body Politic, M.B. T. Maiese and Hanna 2019 has 2 basic aims. First, we aim to integrate philosophy of mind and emancipatory political theory by developing a new subfield called political philosophy of mind, which bears a close affinity to what some have called critical neuroscience. On the philosophy of mind side, we expand on existing work in situated cognitive affectivity that emphasizes the role of scaffolding and examines how aspects of the material and social environment operate to support and augment cognition, affectivity, and agency. In our view, it is important to consider how aspects of the surrounding environment also can have a distorting/detrimental impact on cognition, affectivity, and agency. In addition, we draw from contemporary research on collective intelligence, referred to, for example, MIT Center for Collective Intelligence 2018, John Dewey's notion of habit, Bourdieu's 1977 notion of habitus, and J.J. Gibson's notion of affordances. On the emancipatory political theory side, we draw significantly from Immanuel Kant's philosophy of enlightenment, Marx's existential humanism, the Frankfurt School's critical theory, Foucault's notion of governmentality, and Robert Hanna's 2018 Kant agnosticism and anarchism. Our discussion of this existing work paves the way for a new critique of contemporary social institutions by deploying a special standpoint of the philosophy of mind, and in particular, the special standpoint of the philosophy of what we call essentially embodied minds. Second, we aim to provide a critical analysis of the selective, formative, and mind-shaping impact of social institutions on our human subjective experiences, cognitions, self-consciousness, selfhood, affects, agency, and agential interactions. To accomplish this, we critically consider how neoliberal social institutions and corresponding ideology have a pernicious mind-shaping impact via a consideration of 2 case studies, IA, higher education, and IB, mental health, and we too critically discuss how such institutions might be radically changed so that they become more empowering for the people who inhabit them, allowing them to satisfy their true human needs. Section 2, The Mind-Shaping Thesis. One core doctrine of M.B. T. is the mind-shaping thesis, which says that human agents are fully and essentially embodied, and that their sense-making processes and habits are partially causally determined, formed, and normatively guided, i.e., shaped by the social institutions they belong to or inhabit. This shaping of our embodied minds is not only itself partially causally determined or formed by means of self-reflexive feedback loops, but also irreducibly normative. In this connection, it's essential to note that there are reciprocal feedback relations between individuals and social activity. This means that the individual agent is not simply shaped, but also is an active shaper of herself, other people, and her social environment. Agents have the power to mold their social environments via their active and reactive contributions and responses. By way of what Politic 2009 calls mutual presupposition, the behavior of individuals is patterned by the social group to which they belong, and it is this very patterning of individuals that allows the functioning of the social group 39. The unique contributions of individuals can influence the workings of social institutions, either reinforcing or resisting these socializing practices, and to varying degrees. Consider, for example, a subordinated immigrant within a xenophobic culture and observe that Although she is molded by the culture's ideological structures, she does not internalize ideology and social expectations wholesale. Higgins, 2019. The way she engages with these expectations makes an important difference to her ongoing habit formation. That is, it makes a significant difference whether she reluctantly complies with them, more actively polices/governs herself in accordance with them, or challenges and resists them. Another thing that's essential to note in this connection is that the causal influence of the social environment is irreducibly normative. It directly concerns or expresses human evaluative standards, ideals, codes of conduct, expectations, and/or imperatives. And this normative influence cannot be adequately explained by anything that is not itself already normative. Here we draw from the enactivist approach in philosophy of mind, which emphasizes that at a basic biological level, living organisms gauge meaning and value in relation to norms of self-maintenance and adaptivity. We discuss how, at a more sophisticated level, social norms and values come into play. These norms are underdetermined by biology, and their source does not lie fully within the individual. Instead, these normative constraints are acquired via interaction with the socio-cultural environment. What Rietveld and Kiverstein, 2014, call situated normativity goes beyond mere survival and adaptivity and encompasses norms of adequacy and optimality associated with particular social institutions. Although habits and bodily skills are not governed by explicit rules, they still are subject to a type of normative accountability. The pre-reflective sense of appropriateness or correctness that informs our habits is centered on a norm of optimality. For someone's activity to be sufficiently optimal to cope with the situation at hand, it must be sensitive not only to the structure and organization of their body, but also to the projects or practices in which their body is engaged. All our habits are normative insofar as they are acquired through training, instruction, or socialization, and are subject to evaluation or assessment. People comply with the norms of social institutions because there is a sense in which it contributes to their human flourishing as members of a culture. Some interactions are good for the agent and some are bad. Some modes of coupling with the socio-cultural world are adaptive insofar as they enable the individual to fare well in that social environment, to gain status and social recognition, for example, and some are maladaptive, insofar as they involve heavy penalties or social disapproval. Section 3. Constructive. Enabling social institutions versus destructive. Deforming social institutions. A second core doctrine of M.B.T. is the categorical distinction between two essentially different kinds of social institutions. I. Constructive. Enabling social institutions, and the second destructive, deforming social institutions. While mind-shaping has the potential to be constructive and empowering insofar as it augments and expands upon our capacities in various ways, it also can impose pernicious limitations. Via the formation of inflexible habits, destructive social influences can canalize individual behavior and undermine effective cognition and agency. By a categorical contrast, however, constructive and enabling social institutions help us to self-realize, connect with others in a mutually aiding way, liberate ourselves, and be mentally healthy, authentic, and deeply happy. For example, in a classroom setting with particularly high levels of participation, sense-making becomes a fully coordinated, shared, and multiplied self-legislated activity, so that students engage in what might even be described as a process of joint cognition. Likewise, a good brainstorming session unfolds as a highly coordinated interaction in which many actors participate, and there are fluid patterns of communication and response. While engaging in jointly cognizing group work or other forms of genuinely open academic collaboration, participants sometimes are able to achieve a completely new vantage point on a problem or interpret results in novel ways. As the participants direct one another's attention to specific details or brainstorm solutions, they combine cognitive forces, and the collaborative whole clearly is greater than the sum of its individually agential parts. The collective wisdom of constructive, enabling social institutions involves a relatively high level of social group coordination, creativity, problem-solving, and productivity. In collectively wise social institutions, there is robust solidarity, characterized by joint interests, empathy, and trust. Unfortunately, however, many social institutions in contemporary neoliberal nation-states literally shape our essentially embodied minds, and thereby our lives, in such a way as to alienate us, mentally enslave us, or even undermine our mental health. They make it difficult for us to satisfy our deepest concerns and interests. Such institutions cultivate collective stupidity or even collective sociopathy. Collective stupidity involves a relatively low level of social group coordination, creativity, problem solving, and productivity, and correspondingly a relatively high level of group dysfunctionality. Individual members are out of sync and out of step with one another, acting in mutual resistance, covertly or overtly undermining each other, or even maligning each other. Such groups inevitably suffer from blind spots, limited perspective, and blind conformity. Worse even than collective stupidity, collective sociopathy involves especially high degrees of coercion and vanishingly few opportunities for authentic collaboration. Perspective taking and empathy become very, and sometimes even impossibly difficult. Established policies are coercively imposed. Section 3. Neoliberalism as a generator of destructive, deforming social institutions. Neoliberalism valorizes advanced or late capitalism and is committed to the, quote, an ensemble of ideological and institutional forces whose primary aim is to construct a specific social reality in which virtually all aspects of human life, including human relations, forms of subjectivity, modes of conduct, and/or personal objectives, are managed and evaluated on the basis of market demands. End quote. Esposito and Perez, 2014, page 420. To unpack what neoliberalism is and how it operates, we approach it as I, a policy framework, 2, an ideology, and 3, a form of governmentality. In terms of policy, neoliberalism favors deregulation of the market, the globalization of capital, and the rolling back of the government's welfare state activities. The manifestation of these shifts in policy varies depending on country and context, but general trends include an emphasis on market security, privatization, laissez-faire, and minimal government. Neoliberalism is also an ideology, that is, a system of beliefs, images, or symbols and associated normative values. But the fact that these ideas are loosely formulated, logically slippery, and vaguely defined makes them all the more difficult to pinpoint, critique, and resist. As a mode of governmentality, neoliberalism operates as a system of meaning that constitutes institutions, practices, and identities in contradictory ways. Although neoliberalism favors deregulation of the market, it also involves new forms of governance, namely self-management and self-regulation. In particular, neoliberalism trains people to view themselves as essentially self-interested, atomic, isolated agents, motivated at all times by instrumental rationality, and to regard everything as a competition. What they originally cared about, in the pre-neoliberal state of nature, as it were, shifts. People begin to focus their attention habitually on the economic dimension of human life, while downplaying other social and relational values, such as empathy, cooperation, and collaboration. Higher education, for example, is now focused far more on credentialing and career building than it is on educating. In our view, higher education is best understood as what we are calling a standard dystopian social institution, a neoliberal megamachine that literally shapes subjects' habits of mind, assumptions, mindsets, and learning styles in collectively sociopathic ways. Students, professors, administrators, and staff all are worked upon by neoliberal discourses and expectations, and thus their patterns of interpretation and behavior, i.e. their habits, cannot be understood apart from these influences. By way of social coordination, mimicry, affective resonance, rewards, punishments, and self-policing, they all are habituated in accordance with the expectations and demands of this neoliberal institution. This results in patterns of behavior and attention that make it difficult for them to satisfy their true human needs. Section 4. The Enactive Transformative Principle. The third core doctrine of M. B. T. is the enactive transformative principle, which says that enacting salient changes in the structure and complex dynamics of a social institution produces corresponding changes in the structure and dynamics of the minds of the people who inhabit that institution. This means that we can significantly change our own and other people's essentially embodied minds, and in turn, their lives, whether for worse or better, by means of changing the social institutions we and they inhabit. Existing destructive, deforming social institutions thereby can be transformed into new constructive, enabling social institutions. In constructive, enabling institutions, decision-making is collaborative. 2. Democratic forms of engagement are scaffolded/supported. 3. Participants develop flexible habits of mind and are continually open to new perspectives. And 4. Questioning, critical self-reflection, and imagining things otherwise are all encouraged and primed. We argue that transformative learning environments can serve as a model for the reverse engineering of constructive, enabling social institutions more generally. Such institutions centrally involve the affordance, realization, and promotion of flexible habits of mind. Flexible habits involve embodied affective framing that is self-realizing, organicist, dignitarian, integrative, authenticating, autonomous, deeply responsible, and critically conscious. These flexible habits allow agents to be sensitive and responsive to relevant considerations and nuanced in a complicated, changing world. So, based on the paradigm case of transformative learning environments, all constructive, enabling institutions allow individuals to develop, flourish, and thereby achieve their full rational human potential. By cultivating and promoting sympathetic curiosity, unbiased responsiveness, and openness of mind. Dewey, 1916, Chapter 4. More specifically, we argue that an examination of transformative learning provides us with a working model for how to scaffold the development of capacities for creative and imaginative problem-solving, collective wisdom, and robust solidarity, so that people are in a better position to satisfy their own and others' true human needs. Quote, effective learners in an emancipatory democratic society, a learning society, become a community of cultural critics and social activists, and the dichotomy of individual and society is transcended by understanding knowledge and learning as intersubjective. End quote. Fleming, 2012, page 134. Transformative learning environments thereby ground positive self-transformation and effective reframing. We argue that this sort of personal transformation necessarily encompasses changes that occur at a pre-reflectively conscious, affective, bodily level, and that these changes are bound up inextricably with shifts in cognitive functioning and intentional agency. A subject's new openness and attunement to certain features of their surroundings involves a shift that is simultaneously both cognitive and affective, and this change in cognitive affective orientation brings with it a transformation of an essentially embodied subject's habits of mind, which should be understood best as a dramatic shift in affective framing patterns. Transformative change at the institutional level, therefore, goes hand in hand with transformative change at the individual level. Article 3. Enactivist distributed cognition and the role of distributed social practices in social change. By Mason Cash. I'm completely on board with the account of social and political philosophy of mind that Maiese and Hanna, 2019 present. I've defended one like it, but much less fleshed out, Cash 2010, 2013. I particularly admire and applaud their objective of resisting neoliberal thinking, with its tendency to focus exclusively on the individual. They identify this as an ideological cognitive bias that can impede examination of social institutional factors that cultivate and scaffold particular habits of mind and of our collective agential life inside social institutions. Maiese and Hanna, 2019, page 163. However, I see in M and H.'s account and description some individualistic assumptions that I want to enjoin them to also let go of to better achieve this objective. In what follows, I suggest ways to augment M and H.'s analysis, preserving their central insights about analyses about social structures that mind-shape individuals, about power, and about processes of social change, while at the same time allowing for descriptions of structural mind-shaping, power and social change that are even less individualistic and more distributed in normative communities. Section 1. Extended versus distributed cognition. M. And H.'s essential embodiment thesis sees cognition as necessarily and completely embodied in individual human animals, whose cognition is supported and embedded, but not extended by social and environmental factors. 8. Many inactivists, like myself, agree with a version of this thesis that individual, conscious, essentially embodied human animals should play a core role in accounts of cognition. However, many of us inactivists resist the notion of cognition as extended around individuals, but not by retreating further into internalism and individualism as M&D do. Rather, we inactivists see cognition and agency as distributed across wider dynamic emergent systems that essentially include, but are not limited to, individual human animals. By we inactivists I mean myself, but also people like Sean Gallagher, 2020, Hanna de Jager and Ezekiel D. Paulo, 2007, Dan Hutto and Eric Mine, 2017, John Sutton, 2010, Deborah Tollefson, 2015, Michael Wheeler, 2020, and Dan Zahavi, 2021, and others. For instance, the agent that installed a new garbage disposal in my sink was me plus some tools, an instruction booklet, and a YouTube video. On such an inactivist approach, these wider distributed cognitive systems also include the socio-normative factors M and H. Detail. Institutions and social practices with their shared values, norms, meanings, affective framings, and bodily habits that mind shape individuals' cognition and action. The system that produced and installed garbage disposal also includes social institutions and other people that create, maintain, and distribute such tools, instruction books, and YouTube videos. It also includes many social conventions and practices, many of which have become embodied skills and habits, such as the righty-tighty, lefty-loosey convention and the English language. The system also includes other people, my parents, friends, teachers, colleagues, and bosses who taught me these skills and conventions, and who inducted me into these normative social linguistic practices. All these are essentially involved in the sense that I could not have done this without them. Credit for the installation might be concentrated on me, the individual who worked with his head under the sink for a while, but some credit is also distributed across the social and technological system that enabled me to do this. Importantly, embracing such a conception of socially and technologically distributed cognition and action contradicts almost nothing of M and H's central argument about social and institutional aspects of cognition, and it also helps undermine the neoliberal individualism that M and H critique. It just requires letting go of the unnecessary and counterproductive thesis that human minds are completely embodied, and that social and technological factors support and scaffold, but do not extend, human cognition. An important consequence of this reframing is the possibility of joint or collective cognition and agency. There are some actions that we did rather than I did that and they did too. Examples include co-authors who wrote a book together, a sports team who won the game, NASA, who planned and successfully completed a mission to the ISS, diverse and distributed feminist and anti-racist communities, who resist and reform gendered and racist systems of oppression. M and H come close to recognizing joint cognition and agency when discussing the Jager and D. Paulo's 2007 Enactivist Participatory Sense-Making, page 67. Meaning is often generated. M and H explain over the course of social engagement between participants whose bodily responsiveness, desires, and points of view are coordinated and interdependent. Through this coordination, new domains of social sense-making can be generated that were not available to each individual on her own. M and H, page 67, quoting de Jager and D. Paulo, page 497. Enactivists like de Jager and D. Paulo, 2007, page 493. However, see this as a form of collective agency, not just coordinated and interdependent individual agency. For instance, a conversation between co-authors, bouncing ideas off one another, augmenting and reshaping one another's contributions, they argue, has a degree of autonomy that is not reducible to the contributions or effective framings of either participant alone. In such social interactions, the coupling itself constitutes an emergent autonomous organization in the domain of relational dynamics, without destroying in the process the autonomy of the agents involved, though the latter's scope can be augmented or reduced. Page 493, emphasis added. M and H, however, frame such a coupled system as individuals coordinating with and mutually modulating other individuals. Page 64 to 68. They describe the coupled interaction and the meanings generated as multiply self-legislated, page 68, rather than jointly legislated. For de Jaeger and D. Paulo, in contrast, participatory sense-making is distributed across the collective, which itself can have some degree of emergent autonomy. Inactive accounts like this, I have previously argued, Cash 2010-2013, should embrace a relational conception of autonomy. Also refer to Friedman 1997, Myers 2005. This rejects a liberal notion of autonomous action that involves being independent of external social influences. Instead, it recognizes that autonomous individuals are socialized into normative communities and practices, yet are able, often with others, to critically reflect on and engage with social, technological, and especially normative factors, recruiting, endorsing, and enhancing some, rejecting and resisting others, to construct an authentic, responsible, autonomous self, able to act autonomously within this social and relational context. Distributed and collective inactive accounts of cognition and action then seem very compatible with M and H's overall description of our shared social institutional life within shared normative forms of human life that are essentially embodied, genuinely intersubjective, and normatively enacted and reinforced, which have their own specific structure and sociodynamics, page 87, emphases in the original. In addition, if we accept inactive cognition and action in this distributed collective form, we might see reasons to acknowledge even wider collectives like communities and their shared normative practices that have a distributed existence, autonomy, and even agency of their own that is not fully dependent on or in the control of any particular individual. And this brings me to a more important point about how control and power can operate via mind-shaping individuals within and between such distributed and collective cognitive systems. I believe this can augment M and H's account of the nature of social institutions and the mechanisms of social change. Section 2. Institutions and normative communities. Rather than defining institutions, M and H give a maximally broad list of exemplars, page 4 to 5. In their lists and descriptions, they present institutions as somewhat formally organized social structures in which power and structure are mostly imposed from the top down. Institutions maintain their structure and organization through mind-shaping individuals. That is, by scaffolding and supporting our abilities, values, and emerging sense of self by helping us to develop habits and skills that we need to navigate our surroundings. Page 76. This is how individuals come to implicitly endorse and habitually embody the institution's shared normative forms of life. M and H's analysis of more formal top-down institutions can be augmented or complemented by also understanding the kind of low-level peer-to-peer mind-shaping and distributed structures of power and coercion found in informal communities and their shared normative practices. M and H's list of institutions and their descriptions does not include more informal peer-to-peer normative communities, within which a lot of mind-shaping also happens. Parenting and sibling relationships, friendships, co-workers, teammates, and church congregations, as well as a host of informal normative communities, such as drivers who share local roadways, shoppers at a grocery store, passengers on an airplane together, people attending the same sports event or philosophy conference, and so on. In these informal normative relationships and communities, people's actions, values, affective framings, and embodied habits mind-shape each other rather than, or as well as, being imposed from positions of power. Sally Haslanger, 2019, page 5 to 6, makes a distinction that can help here between oppression or injustice that is repressive, coercively enforced, and oppression and injustice that is ideological. Ideological oppression, she argues, is embedded in forms of coordination that we are highly motivated to engage in and engage in fluently. Results of such coordinations are often valuable, and the terms of such engagement come to constitute our self-standings and our identities. Page 6. The structures that Haslanger illuminates as playing a strong role in ideological oppression are not just structures of centralized institutional coercive power, but also sets of interconnected normative practices, patterns of behavior that enable us to coordinate due to learned skills and locally transmitted information in response to resources and whose performances are mutually accountable by reference to shared schemas/social meanings. Page 7. The distinctions between these two types of oppression and between institutions and distributed normative communities map onto the differences between depictions of power in M and H, S, and Haslinger's accounts. M and H, S account focuses primarily on the use of top-down power over others, in which those in power impose an organization and structure onto the group. Thus, destructive deforming institutions involve one person or group oppressing another using coercive power, and designing a constructive enabling institution may require using local hierarchy. 289. In deliberate efforts and design by those in power towards realization and promotion of flexible habits of mind in others, perhaps through transformative learning. Their Chapter 7 concludes by 290. Suggesting that this should not be achieved through authoritarian coercion, but rather by institutions that enable individuals' creativity, love of work, and natural desire for making meaningful social connections. But even there, the organization of such environments seems created and imposed from the top down, albeit through structures that foster collaborative decision-making. In contrast, consider the power distributed in social communities and their normative and discursive practices. Haslanger, page 14, argues, quoting Nancy Fraser's 1989 interpretation of Foucault, 1979, that this form of power operates at the lowest extremities of the social body in everyday social practices. That is, power is distributed throughout social communities and their discursive practices, symbolic resources, and shared meanings. It operates through members of communities sanctioning and reinforcing one another's actions and values, meanings, affective framings, and self-conceptions. The shared social realities in which we are mind-shaped and are constituted as the kinds of subjects we become are not just a matter of top-down institutional coercion that becomes self-coercion. As M and H explain, it is also a matter of the productive ways that symbolic power is distributed among the socio-normative practices of a community, whose members coerce and mind-shape one another. Consider, for example, communities in which COVID-19 vaccine hesitancy was prevalent. In The Atlantic, sociologist Brooke Harrington, 2021, explains that many people in a conservative Missouri district were afraid of being seen while getting vaccinated and wanted privacy at the vaccination site. Harrington argues that sociology is useful in understanding this phenomenon because vaccine refusal is not an individual problem, but a social one. Quote, in Missouri and other red states, vaccine refusal on partisan grounds has become a defining marker of community affiliation. Acceptance within some circles is contingent on refusal to cooperate with the Biden administration's public health campaign. Getting vaccinated is a betrayal of that group norm, and those who get the shot can legitimately fear losing their job or incurring the wrath of their families and other reference groups. End quote. Harrington, 2021. Community sanction among peers is a driving force, and it seems to be relatively out of the control of power elites at this stage. For example, Even though former President Trump is vaccinated and encourages vaccination, at a public event in December 2021 when Trump shared that he had received the vaccine booster shot, many in the crowd, ostensibly his supporters, booed Pabera and McCarthy 2021. This distributed form of power is implied by many points M and H, raise. But their emphasis seems to be primarily on institutions that coercively impose values, meanings, effective framings, and habits of bodily comportment on individuals, and on individuals who are mind-shaped by such institutions coming to self-impose them. It helps, I think, to explicitly highlight this other distributed form of power and social conditioning in which members of a normative community reinforce, sanction, and influence, that is, mind-shape, one another into inhabiting particular shared forms of life. Section 3. Institutions are not wholly creative or destructive. M and H seem to commit rather strongly to a bifurcation of institutions into two types. They identify 8 criteria that are characteristic of constructive, enabling institutions. These enable people to meet their true needs. Their opposites define destructive, deforming institutions, in which it is difficult for people to meet their true needs. However, consider again the Missourians afraid that others in their community will see their vaccination as disloyalty. Why maintain loyalty to a community when you believe that some of that community's practices and judgments are not in your best interests? The answer is that most institutions and communities are not wholly constructive or wholly deforming, in satisfying or undermining all 8 of M and H S criteria. As Harrington, 2021, points out, shifting from an individual to a relational perspective helps us understand why people are seeking vaccination in disguise. They want to save face within the very specific set of social ties that sociologists call reference groups, the neighborhoods, churches, workplaces, and friendship networks that help people obtain the income, information, companionship, mutual aid, and other resources they need to live. The price of access to those resources is conformity to group norms. That is, communities whose norms and practices reinforce vaccine refusal are not wholly toxic. People in these communities also get many of their basic needs met within such communities. They get vaccinated in disguise because perceived disloyalty may threaten these benefits and supports. Many communities and institutions are comprised of a multitude of different, intersecting and overlapping practices, whose members interact in complicated ways. These practices might well be constructive and enabling in some ways and also destructive and deforming in others. They may be populated by some people who endorse the institution's structures, while others in the community resist and undermine them. And this brings me to my final point. We can augment M and H.'s model of social change, centered around their analysis of institutions and their more centralized power to mind-shape individuals, by giving explicit attention also to distributed cognition and action, and to the forms of power embedded in low-level peer-to-peer, mind-shaping interactions between members of distributed social communities and normative practices. Section 4. Social change is complicated. M and H depict positive social change and the development of collective wisdom as largely a matter of the top-down design of constructive enabling social institutions, Chapter 7, or by individuals scaffolded and assisted by constructive and enabling social institutions, either succumbing to or resisting institutional mind-shaping to various degrees. However, I'm suggesting that social change is also, and perhaps more so, a matter of distributed and collective agency, the organic growth and spread of communities and their practices through peer-to-peer interaction. There is good reason to see societies as constituted by a diverse range of overlapping, intersecting, interacting, normative communities, whose different shared practices, values, effective framings, shared meanings, and embodied habits are constantly affecting one another through individuals' interactions. Social change, then, especially against structures of domination, is often not just a matter of individuals coordinating their resistance with other individuals, but a matter of communities of dominated people together, creating alternative communities and mind-shaping practices. Individuals who resist structures of domination, as Sally Haslinger, 2019, page 15 to 20, argues, are usually members of dominated groups who collectively support one another in creating and inhabiting alternative hidden heterodox communities of resistance, practices, and values. These communities create and support forms of mind shaping that resist and provide alternative practices, meanings, values, effective framings, and habits of bodily comportment to those of the dominant ideology. Eventually, these subversive practices mind shape others outside of the community of resistance and might become a more dominant ideology. In fact, a primary means of progressive change against an oppressive orthodoxy is a heterodox community creating what might initially be hidden meanings and practices that make explicit and more publicly recognized the arbitrariness and unfairness of the taken for granted oppressive orthodox ideology and its values, judgments, effective framings, and embodied habits. These hidden practices and meanings might eventually, after being sculpted through internal interactions, start to play a role in members' interactions with the wider community, bringing the dominant community's hidden meanings and practices into more public view. Note the recent introduction into public discourse of terms like mansplaining and manspreading. For example, much social change, then, happens organically at the periphery, through low-level interactions within a society, between members of different communities with different practices, meanings, values, effective framings, and habits of bodily comportment. While members of subcommunities of resistance articulate their heterodox shared practices and attempt to spread them more widely, members of the dominant community might push back against such practices. Such backlash takes many forms, including ridiculing or ignoring them, or depicting them as crazy nonsense or uppity, etc. Through cross-cultural interactions like this, there is a push and pull between communities and practices competing in terms of spread and power. Sometimes the norms of heterodox communities might become orthodoxy themselves. It is perhaps helpful to think of such interactions between members of different communities as attempts to mind shape one another. For example, a coworker says or does something that they think is socially appropriate, like telling a sexist or racist joke. But they're corrected by someone with an identity shaped in a heterodox community of resistance who feels that this behavior is not or should not be appropriate. Such interactions, especially when repeated, have the potential to influence the meanings, values, effective framings, and habits of bodily comportment of the participants. Repeated such interactions might make deep and long-lasting changes in their practices, community affiliations, and their identities. In such interactions, change in the spread of practices across a society and in individuals' practices and affiliations is also dependent on the distribution of low-level power. This power is a matter of there being support among other individuals around an interaction for a particular move in that interaction, e.g., in calling out actions that reinforce structures of domination. When a person witnesses a colleague telling that sexist joke, for example, and feels or expects that enough of the others witnessing it share their practices, such that witnesses will accept and support a correction as more reasonable and appropriate than this offensive joke, they might feel confident enough to make such a correction, believing that they will be supported. 12. The autonomous actions of individuals who engage in acts of resistance. Then, is relational autonomy constructed and distributed within and, importantly, supported by communities of resistance and their heterodox practices, as is the autonomy of those in the dominant community pushing back against such alternative practices. Given all this, feminist movements and the improved justice and reduced oppression they continue to create should not just be seen as the result of a group of individuals coordinating their individual acts of resistance, nor as powerful individuals designing a non-sexist, constructive, and enabling institution as M and H. Describe Chapter 7. Rather, the agents of social change are distributed feminist communities themselves. This social change, as with most social change, is an example of collective and distributed cognition and action. It has largely been brought about organically and systematically by the community of resistance that arose in response to structures of repressive and ideological domination. Members of dominated groups, e.g., feminist consciousness-raising groups, together mind-shape one another, creating and inhabiting more constructive and enabling practices, social norms, shared meanings, effective framings, and embodied habits. These practices eventually spread through members' mind-shaping interactions with others to the wider community. This model of change happening as a result of mind-shaping interactions within communities and between members of different communities, spreading practices of resistance across a society, also applies to the example of destructive deforming neoliberal ideology in higher education. That M and H. Detail in Chapter 4. M and H. Describe some troubling trends that seem designed to reshape institutions of higher education by imposing neoliberal individualist and corporatist practices and values. But universities, like any community or institution, are constituted by diverse and distributed, competing subcommunities. And many of us who also are part of these institutions resist this neoliberal ideology by inhabiting and enacting normative communities whose educational practices are more emancipatory and enabling organicis, autonomy enhancing, true desire promoting, and critical consciousness priming, etc. We do this in many ways. In how we conduct classes, design classes, courses, and curricula, in how we interact with students, in how we encourage one another to research and teach, in how we conduct ourselves in allegedly shared governance committees. M and H. Describe such educational practices when discussing transformative educational experiences. Footnote 277. This community that values and practices emancipatory and enabling forms of education spans faculty, students, and many members of the wider community, and even some university administrators. We have distributed ground-level power to resist the ways that such deforming, destructive neoliberal institutions and practices are being imposed, often but not exclusively from the top down. This distributed power, I hope, is not insignificant. There is a struggle for power in higher education between different communities and practices. The push and pull of these constructive and deforming communities and practices in competition, resisting and contradicting and undermining one another, produces a wide variety of educational experiences. And students with those experiences go into the wider community and interact with others, spreading their contrasting values, effective framings, priorities, and experiences into the wider community's many conversations and interactions about the purposes and values of higher education. Effective resistance, in part, also depends on this community making explicit the problematic meanings, assumptions, and effective framings of the neoliberal, destructive, deforming community. Many of us are doing just that. M and H. SCH4 is a worthy contribution to this effort. But I'm reluctant to believe that this depiction of neoliberal policies, norms, and practices is a whole story, or that it makes higher education overall a destructive, deforming institution. Our communities of resistance for enhancing an emancipatory education, which M and H also describe in Chapter 7, are also part of the higher education community. And we have a lot of community support, distributed power, in pushing back against these social forces. Section 5. These are complementary accounts. I hasten to add, in conclusion, that I take this approach to augment and complement M and H's account of the ways social institutions mind-shape people's cognition, values, meanings, effective framings, and habits of bodily comportment, and of the ways neoliberal individualism can be resisted and progressive social change can be enacted. The overall approach here can be furthered by letting go of their individualistic retreat to seeing cognition as completely embodied in individuals, and instead embracing enactivist accounts of socially distributed and collective cognition and action in which cognitive systems include but are not limited to individuals. Seeing communities, not just individuals, as sometimes the locus of cognition and action opens the door to seeing mind shaping within and between members of communities and practices, in peer-to-peer interactions between members of distributed normative social practices. Seeing diverse institutions that are not wholly destructive deforming, nor wholly constructive and enabling, and Seeing processes of social change through competition, differing distributions of power, between competing normative communities with different practices, and especially between communities of resistance, offering alternative practices to dominant ideologies. This also enables us to better understand how to help bring about progressive social change in improving justice and reducing oppression. In addition to top-down design and reform of institutions, we can also help distributed normative communities of resistance to spread their practices. By making explicit and public the unfairness and arbitrariness of practices that were once taken for granted, by better understanding the way distributed forms of productive power can be employed, by employing such power when we think we have it, to support one another in challenging unfair orthodox practices, and by explicitly committing to give such help, so that others can trust in our support when making challenges. Such commitments might come in the form of explicit institutional policies, as well as more distributed norms. Article 4. Master Narratives. Ideology Embedded and Embodied. By Alan Jurgens. There is a lot to admire in Maiese and Hanna's 2019. The Mind-Body Politic, in its examination of the effects social institutions have on individuals' cognition and well-being. By combining the enactive approach from philosophy of mind with political and social theory, their analysis provides new insights on how institutions and social practices shape minds for better or worse. At the center of their analysis is the mind-shaping thesis that the sociodynamic patterns of embodied minds are saliently constrained by social institutions that fundamentally affect our lives, generally without self-conscious awareness. Following Bourdieu 1977, they claim that socio-material institutions, in relationship to our particular forms of embodiment, partly determine our formation of cognition and action in terms of habits and affective framing patterns, which produce specific bodily know-how and ways of being in the world. According to Maiese and Hanna, such habits of mind encompass schemas for interacting and engaging with one's environment. 2019, page 46, emphasis in the original. And the schemas that one adopts will determine what features of people and event they will attend to, what they ascribe value towards, and what views or beliefs they'll find acceptable. In the book, the author specifically examined the effects of the neoliberal university and healthcare institutions as case studies for how institutions can have detrimental and deforming effects on individuals. This focus on neoliberalism is essential, as they rightly claim that neoliberalism has become part of the contemporary world's common sense and is now regarded by the vast majority of people in democratic and non-democratic societies alike to be the most natural way of viewing the world and human existence. Maiese and Hanna 2019, page 27, emphases in the original. Borrowing Mark Fisher's notion of capitalist realism, they emphasize that a capitalist ideology is now so deeply entrenched in the culture and structure of many institutions in the world, such that there is now a widespread sense that not only is capitalism the only viable political and economic system, but also that it is now impossible even to imagine a coherent alternative. Fisher 2009. Page 2, cited in Maiese and Hanna 2019, page 27, emphasis in the original. Essentially, I am in near complete agreement with this focus, their justification for it, and their analysis of how the neoliberal university and healthcare institutions deform and harm not only the well-being of individuals, but their cognitive capacities as well. Nevertheless, in this commentary, I argue that by expanding their analysis through adopting a narrative analysis to examine the role that narratives play in shaping the social and material conditions of institutions and individuals' cognition, it is possible to offer a fuller explanation of the effects of ideology. This is because a narrative analysis is able to examine how our particular embodied habits and affective framing patterns, our schemas, change through our engagements with specific sociocultural narratives. Sociocultural narratives are narratives that establish, shape, and reinforce cultural beliefs and practices and societal social structures, process, and organizations. At the foundation of a narrative analysis is the assumption that narratives at their core do two things. First, they provide syntheses of conceptual and affective knowledge that present particular ways of perceiving and experiencing the world, i.e., narrative schemas. Second, narratives and narrative understanding underlay the foundation of our capacity to understand others and ourselves and shape our ways of being in the world. Hutto 2008, Rustin 2017. Thus, through encountering and embracing new kinds of effective framing patterns and habits found within narratives, our own effective framing patterns and habits shift to align with these new ways of being in the world. According to Bruner, 1991, and Nelson, 2003, narratives are discursive ways to make sense of events in terms of human intentions, affection, and motivation. Importantly, by working with this broad and minimal definition, it's possible to capture the wide variety of narratives found in every culture and society, whether they be fictional, historical, religious, or personal. The term master narrative was introduced by Lyotard in 1979 as a critique of institutional and ideological forms of knowledge. Following Erickson 1959-1968, master narratives provide a system of beliefs and ways of being in the world that says something about one's social and political location. In this sense, as Hammack and Tullis, 2015, page 355, explain, one's identity is both process. It is made through social practice and product. It is codified in the personal narrative that integrates the discourse of master narratives, but identities are always constructed from social and political locations. Importantly, master narratives function in relation to ideologies as means for implementing and disseminating the beliefs, values, and practices of an ideology. In doing so, master narratives not only explain, but also legitimate identities and knowledge by establishing and maintaining power relations, norms, and habits. Additionally, as stated above, and as Jones and Macbeth, 2010, page 330, have highlighted, there is substantial empirical evidence that suggests narratives are a primary means by which individuals organize, process, and convey information, and that they play a crucial role in shaping beliefs and actions. In addition to the notion of a master narrative, I want to introduce here the notion of a local narrative. While we can understand neoliberalism as an ideology and the American dream as a master narrative that disseminates this ideology, we can further distinguish local narratives that reflect the structure and contents of a master narrative in a particular local context. The most common example here is when an individual's achievements are praised due to their hard work by either the local news or within an institution or organization's newsletter. Typically, this involves a narrative that mirrors the structure of the American dream, where the success is attributed primarily to the individual themselves, reinforcing the beliefs and values of a neoliberal ideology, where one is primarily responsible for their own success and must pull themselves up by their bootstraps. Through encountering these kinds of local narratives, an individual's own understanding of themselves and their place in the world, their personal narrative is in turn shaped in one way or another. Not only do local narratives influence individuals' personal narratives, but they also shape their cognitive processes, effective framing patterns, habits, and more generally, their experience and way of being in the world, i.e., their schemas. For example, a local narrative of a self-made business person would include detailing the individual's beliefs and values, their motivational drive for success, and the kinds of habits and practices they employ to attain success. The details of this local narrative would involve presenting specific kinds of embodied and adaptive knowledge to succeed in a particular environment. Both the reason for presenting this specific local narrative and the goal the narrative is meant to achieve would be to inspire others to ascribe to the values laid out in the narrative and to adopt the cognitive processes, effective framing patterns, and habits described in the narrative. Having provided a brief exposition of narratives and narratives analysis, I want to continue following the integrative path laid out by Maiese and Hanna by drawing together insights from inactive philosophers of mind with work from social and political philosophy. I'll next turn to an exposition of Maiese and Hanna's 2019 discussion of habits, effective framing patterns, and the issue of the backfire effect. Their discussion of the backfire effect is particularly important as it encompasses an analysis of the phenomenon of individuals resisting changes to their beliefs, effective framing patterns, and habitual ways of being in the world. Then, I'll show how it's possible to shed more light on why individuals might be resistant to these kinds of change by applying a narrative analysis and drawing on narrativist work from social and political theory. I do this by arguing that it is possible to clarify why individuals experience the backfire effect in the face of evidence that should give them reasons to reject the core beliefs of neoliberalism. Through an understanding of neoliberalism as an ideology that is embedded in and disseminated through master narratives, such as the American dream and local narratives. Section 1. Habits, Effective Framing Patterns, and the Backfire Effect. Maiese and Hanna, 2019, page 269, argue that effective framing of objects, situations, or events are the jumping-off points for more sophisticated cognitive and practical processes. In Chapter 7, they emphasize the importance of this position that effective reframing plays a central, fundamental role in personal, moral, and political transformation, which is made possible in one way via particular kinds of educational institutions. Page 287, emphases in the original. Their position is that by developing constructive, enabling educational institutions, it is possible to socially reverse engineer individuals who presumably have already accepted capitalist realism in order to promote robust solidarity and emancipation from oppression, and cultivate flexible habits of mind. Page 287. The authors focus most of their discussion here on how learning of others' ways of being in the world, within a constructive, enabling educational institution, can lead to significant changes in the effective framing patterns and habits of an individual. In this regard, they say that listening to and imaginatively exploring others' perspectives and ways of life can effectively move students, disrupt their existing schemas, and radically change the way that they frame the topics under discussion. To see and hear and feel another person give voice to an alternative perspective is to have that point of view become something real, in your face, and subjectively potent. Maiese and Hanna, 2019, page 278, emphasis in the original. By directly encountering others' emotional responses to their experiences of oppression, an individual's own emotional response can help her realize previously unconsidered ways of experiencing and being in the world. This can then lead to a radical shift in her own effective framing patterns and habits, i.e., their schemas. While I would not want to downplay the importance of engaging directly with others different from us in order to develop more flexible habits and effective frames, we can nevertheless also gain access to different perspectives through engagement with narratives. Maiese and Hanna do recognize this, as there are a number of occasions in the last 2 chapters of the book in which the authors highlight the importance of narratives in this reforming process. For example, they appeal to Yorks and Cazles, 2002, page 187, claim that by affording glimpses into the other's world of experience, expressive ways of knowing such storytelling, drawing, and dance can help learners to shift their perspective. Maiese and Hanna, 2019, page 280 to 281. Similarly, drawing on Carden, 2006, and Cody's 2015 work, they claim that like dance, drama practice can also foster flexible mental habits by allowing individuals to adopt the point of view of a character very different from themselves and to seriously consider alternative perspectives. Maiese and Hanna, 2019, page 283. By not only imagining themselves as a different character in a different social role, but also through adopting the associated behavior, acting allows one to experience and experiment with a range of bodily habits and points of view. This kind of embodied narrative practice can provide the opportunity to open up space for raising questions about power, identity, society, and big capitalism. Page 284. Yet, we may not always have opportunities to directly engage with others different from us, nor to engage in particular kinds of art. Though, even when we can engage in these kinds of experiences, changing one's habitual ways of engaging with the world is not easy. Maiese and Hanna, 2019, page 300, emphasize this point with their discussion of the backfire effect, which is when individuals faced with information or experiences that run counter to their standing beliefs and habits entrench themselves further into their position as opposed to embracing change. Citing a study by Nyhan and Reifler, 2010, the authors explain how individuals presented with corrective information after reading political news articles systematically responded to the corrective information in accordance with their previously held ideological beliefs. Instead of changing their opinion on the political issue, often the participants responded in ways that maintained and entrenched their established beliefs. Expanding on this issue, the authors claim that the backfire effect shows that cognitive walls, especially those concerning persistent false beliefs, memories, stereotypical mental images, feelings, or emotions, are self-reinforcing. Maiese and Hanna 2019, page 300, emphasis in the original. As the study showed, when trying to directly confront a person's cognitive walls with contrary correct facts, the higher and thicker he builds his walls, without even knowing what he is doing, and all the while fully convinced that he is in the right, page 300. These cognitive walls that produce the backfire effect are said to be strongest in regard to an individual's 1. Sense of individual identity as a person, and 2. Sense of group identity as a self-identified member of an important social community or institution. The authors argue that cognitive walls can be understood as an individual being stuck in certain affective frames that arise via her engagement with destructive, deforming social institutions. Page 301, emphasis in the original. In order to overcome one's cognitive walls and limit the occurrence of the backfire effect, the authors claim that these walls need to be critically and freely taken apart by the rational human agent herself, in a transformative process of essentially embodied critical self-education. Page 300, emphases in the original. They argue that this requires an individual to undergo a cognitive affective revolution, which is comprised of significant changes in her affective framing patterns and habits. 303. However, the authors claim that these kinds of changes are not easy to undertake, as most people are desperately afraid of and deeply averse to doing this, and as such, when having an experience that may develop more cognitive flexibility or change in one's mental habits, instead a backfire effect can occur. 303. Thus, they recognize that the backfire effect can occur when an individual encounters disruption to their customary ways of behaving, where there are unusually high amount of incoherence between their pre-existing understandings and the new ideas that they encounter, which leads to a retrenching and retreating into pre-existing ways of thinking. Concepcion and Elfin 2009, cited in Maiese and Hanna 2019, page 303 to 304. Drawing on Maiese 2016, the authors, Maiese and Hanna 2019, 307 to 308, argue that in order to break down cognitive walls and avoid the backfire effect, we must problematize the very categories through which the citizens see the world. They claim this can occur through shifting one's habits by not only having different kinds of bodily experiences, but also through engaging with storytelling and arts of all kinds. In this sense, by being exposed to 1. Different kinds of artistic expression, such as dystopian narrative works of fiction, and 2. Real-life experiences that relate the alternative perspectives and divergent life experiences of others, it's possible to alter one's habits and break down established cognitive walls. Nevertheless, while Maiese and Hanna discuss in a bit more detail how narratives can be used to overcome cognitive walls and the backfire effect, I argue that through employing a narrative analysis, we can better understand why an individual may be averse to a particular cognitive affective revolution, i.e., why a backfire effect might occur. Section 2. The American Dream as a master narrative for neoliberalism. By expanding on the established work of enactivists Hutto 2008, 2015, Juergens 2022, on the role narratives play in the ontogenesis of social cognitive capacities and identity, with the concept of a master narrative from social and political philosophy, Hammock and Tullis 2015, Rustin 2017, we can better understand how master, local, and personal narratives function to not only generate meaning, but also establish habits and effective framing patterns. This is because through identifying which master and local narratives a particular individual or social group ascribe to, we can better understand their ideological commitments and their underlying reasons for having particular sociocultural norms and values. Thus, by utilizing a narrative analysis, we can better understand not only how detrimental habits, affective frames, and cognitive walls develop, but also how we may be resistant to change or have our cognitive walls broken down. Essentially, narratives illuminate, which events are significant and why for individuals within particular social groups, Roth 1991, page 178, and do so by selectively focusing on the elements that are relevant to our interests and to the interests of our audience, Goldie 2012, page 16. Narratives not only situate events in a certain light against a larger socio-material frame, providing explanations in terms of the rational and effective reasons why individuals act in particular ways in certain situations, Hutto and Juergens 2018. But they also provide schemas for habitual ways of navigating the world and introduce us to different kinds of effective framing patterns. Similarly, master narratives influence perception and decision-making as they function as vehicles and creators of values and ideology, Rustin 2017, page 28, and often lead to local narratives that reflect the structures and contents of the master narrative in further disseminating values and ideologies. For this reason, in order to understand the decisions and actions of individuals, it is critical to examine the master and local narratives that they ascribe and relate to, as these particular narratives inform the individual's relationships to socio-political events, agents, and institutions that they encounter in the world. Similar to Maiese and Hanna's discussion of cognitive walls, Brannigan, 1992, and Rustin, 2017, argue that there is an ongoing process of narrative comprehension where an individual employs trial and error to fit new experiences into previously established narrative schemas. Rustin explains that a narrative schema is understood as a pattern shared across different narratives that organizes information, such as beliefs, norms, and ways of being in and responding to the world, in a particular way. He argues that if the new experience or information that an individual encounters cannot be organized into an existing narrative schema, then either a new schema must be adopted and employed or, similar to a backfire effect, the information is rejected. If we take narrative comprehension, here is not only the experience of encountering narratives, but also the ways in which individuals narratively experience and understand the world itself, and how they understand themselves through their own personal narratives, then we can better understand how detrimental cognitive walls are developed and how the backfire effect occurs. In regard to the study Maiese and Hanna discuss, a narrative analysis would focus on the local and master narratives the participants have already ascribed to, in order to further understand not only their ideological commitments, but also what kinds of effective framing patterns and habits they've developed. These commitments will also be reflected in their personal narratives, how they see themselves in the world, where they've been, and where they're going. This additional narrative information can then help explain not only why they reject the corrective information, but also to predict and explain how they will reframe this information in order for it to align with their established narrative schemas and ways of being in the world. While there is an effective component at work here, this component is tied directly to the established narrative schemas that the participants have not just internalized, but embodied in terms of the kinds of habits and effective framing patterns that they have and the personal narrative they have constructed. Essentially, what is missing in Maiese and Hanna's analysis of the backfire effect is the role that narrative comprehension plays in determining whether we're ready to break down or reaffirm a cognitive wall. Drawing on Walter Fisher's 1984 work Scott Rustin, 2017, page 34, argues that this kind of narrative comprehension matters as narratives are another form of rationality that competes with and often supplants logical rationality as the basis of decision-making. Rustin sums up Fisher's 1984 argument as being that the logical rationality approach does not account for emotion, roles of beliefs and values, and many cases in which individuals and groups support positions for which there is no logical explanation, Rustin 2017, page 34. This is because narratives not only provide ways to rationally organize information and experiences, but as Maiese and Hanna only briefly discuss, they can also provide new forms of habits and effective frames that we might adopt. Depending on the particularities of the specific narrative and our familiarity and relationship to the characters and their experiences within those narratives, we may be more or less likely to adopt or reject the new information, effective frames, habits, or more generally, ways of being in the world that we encounter. The key point here is that narrative comprehension provides a different kind of rational engagement beyond pure logical reasoning, as they provide specific ways of feeling and being in the world that we otherwise might not have access to. Additionally, we encounter ideology sets of beliefs, norms, and practices much more regularly through narratives than we do in any other format. Rarely do we read or are told about these specific aspects of ideologies. Rather, we encounter them through narratives in our practical experiences in the world and understand them via narrative understanding. In essence, narratives are templates for making sense of the world and ourselves, and as such, utilizing a narrative analysis is essential for understanding when and how people are ready and open to break down their cognitive walls and adopt new ways of being in the world. As an example, we can briefly examine how a particular master narrative can affect our habitual and effective ways of being in the world. As Peters, 2012, argues, the neoliberal ideology has extended the principle of self-interest into the dominant paradigm for understanding not only politics and economics, but also for all behavior and human action. A master narrative that functions in implementing and disseminating neoliberal ideology is the American Dream narrative. Hammack and Tullis, 2015, discussed the impact of this master narrative in relation to studies of homeless youths, Erickson 1959-1968. These studies showed that these youths had to contend with both economic hardship and stigmatization from others because of the American Dream master narrative. As this narrative attributes poverty and homelessness to individual characteristics, the youth struggled with being perceived as personally unruly, unmotivated, criminal, and pathological by others. Presumably, those who perceived the homeless youths in this way had adopted the habits and effective frames presented within the American Dream master narrative, and within local narratives that reflect the beliefs, norms, and practices presented in the master narrative. For example, the ideas that individuals both bear personal responsibility for their station in life and society, and that hard work will lead to success, which are integrated with a habitual negative affective response towards perceived impoverished individuals. As these ideas and affective frames and responses are so deeply embedded in their habitual ways of being in the world, simply encountering these youths in the world and seeing their hardship was not enough to overcome and break down the cognitive walls these individuals had already established. Nevertheless, despite the pressure of the American Dream narrative on themselves, Hammack and Tullis, 2015, page 357, found that homeless youth had developed resistance to internalizing a sense of personal fault or failure, instead calling attention to structural disadvantage by highlighting the discrimination, violence, neglect, and alienation they faced. While some of the people that the youth encountered embodied the habits and effective framing patterns of the American Dream master narrative, as exhibited in their judgments of the youths own experiences overrode this narrative in terms of their own self-assessment and personal narratives. In line with Maiese and Hanna's analysis, this shows that personal experiences still have a significant determining factor in terms of which narratives we ascribe to and which we resist. Yet, simply encountering the homeless youths was not enough for some to break their cognitive wall and change their ingrained beliefs and practices. Rather, what may be needed for these individuals is a deeper narrative engagement with the fuller details of the personal narratives of the homeless youth on what it is like to become homeless and impoverished for the judgmental individuals to break their cognitive walls. Although Maiese and Hanna are right in their claim that when an individual resists breaking down a cognitive wall, this is because the individual is desperately afraid of and deeply averse to such a significant change in their habitual ways of being in the world. Oftentimes, the reason why they are having these kinds of effective responses is because they are encountering an experience that does not fit with their established narrative understanding of the world and themselves. Or, in other words, they are experiencing something that is not consistent with the other stories they already believe to be true, Rustin 2017. By adopting a narrative analysis, Maiese and Hanna would have additional tools to further investigate and understand how individuals are persuaded to change their manifest values, beliefs, and ideologies, and in turn adopt new habits and effective framing patterns. Thus, if we want to find ways to help individuals break down their cognitive walls, avoid the backfire effect, and develop flexible habits of mind, in order to resist, rebel, and revolutionize destructive, deforming institutions and ideologies like neoliberalism, then we need to understand the essential role that narratives play in establishing, expressing, and resisting ideology. By embracing a narrative analysis, we can further elucidate how cognitive walls are established and how we can break them down.
This marks the end of the 2024, Volume 6, Issue 1 Summer Podcast Edition, Part 1 of the Journal of Philosophy of Emotion. Please go to 2024, Volume 6, Issue 1 Summer Podcast Edition, Part 2 of the Journal of Philosophy of Emotion to continue listening to this issue.